The new polls out Wednesday show Joe Biden maintaining his lead over the Democratic presidential field. The former vice president reportedly would prefer his own potential running mate to not be a white man. Eugene Scott covers politics and wrote about this for the Washington Post, and he joins me now from Washington. Eugene, thanks so much for being with us. How did this sit down with Joe Biden come about?
Well, quite a few black journalists from major media outlets were contacted by the Biden campaign and invited to what was originally pitched as an off-the-record conversation with the vice president. But once we got there, we realized that it was going to be on the record, or at least some of it, and we had the opportunity to ask questions about the issues that we were thinking about most and that were most relevant in the current campaign. And we started speaking about a lot of issues related to race, since that is a popular topic with not just the Biden campaign, but the 2020 election as a whole. But the conversations went beyond that as well.
Interesting. So Biden said that a running mate would need to be someone he could, quote, completely and thoroughly trust, as authentic and on the same page as him. Did he give any clues as to who looks like they're on the same page as him?
He did not, but he spoke often about how he and President Barack Obama worked together. He communicated that he had quite a bit of power and influence in decision-making when it came to policies, when it came to people in positions of power and leadership, and also when it came to when decisions maybe were made and when they were announced. And he wanted to share that experience with his vice presidential candidate, assuming that he actually gets the nomination. He said strategy is not as important all the time as much as philosophy and ideology, and so he certainly wants to be on the same page in terms of value and worldview with whoever he could possibly pick as his vice presidential candidate, assuming he gets the nomination. But he said that would triumph all things, just being on one accord.
Well, Biden is not the only person running for president who has said he'd pick a woman or a person of color as a running mate. Is this a litmus test for Democratic candidates at this point?
I think for some voters it certainly is, and Biden said he would prefer that his vice presidential candidate be a person of a different gender and or ethnicity. But the reality is he actually has not won the nomination yet, but people looking at him, including many voters of color and women voters, are hoping that if he does get the nomination, that his number two person will not be a white male. And so I think he was giving voters a sense that he hears them and he agrees with them. He spoke very often about his campaign looking like the country and him wanting his administration to look like the country if he was elected president. And for him, that starts with picking a nominee that represents some demographic groups that he himself does not.
Well, Joe Biden's lead in the polls, we know, is largely because of his support from African-American voters. Did he talk about how he's cultivating that support in this election?
What he actually spoke about is how he perhaps didn't think he needed to cultivate it because he thinks he has long-lasting relationships with the Black American community. He said repeatedly that he's very comfortable in predominantly Black spaces and very familiar with the issues that Black voters care about most. And it seemed like it was a bit of a jab at perhaps some of his other candidates who don't have as long histories with Black voters, perhaps due to their relative youth or newness to politics. But the vice president spoke not only of his time being the vice president for America's first Black president, but regularly pointed to his 30-plus career in the Senate and his track record working on issues related to civil rights and other topics that are of significance to Black voters. And so he spoke about his ability to win the support of Black Americans because of that. We actually took some time also to ask him about the fact that he's doing really well with voters, regardless of race, over 50, but he's not doing as well with voters under 50, according to some polls, and they may be outliers. But Biden himself said he was not as concerned about that. He believes that the response he receives when he attends college campuses and other events that have large percentages of millennials and Gen Xers, that he's met with great enthusiasm that he believes will eventually be reflected in the polls.
And Eugene, before I let you go, I'm just wondering, is there anything else that stood out to you in this conversation with Joe Biden? Because it is unusual, I think, to have an off-the-record conversation, especially one that is centered on these issues, which could be sensitive of race, of gender, going from an off-the-record conversation to an on-the-record conversation. Was there anything else that jumped out at you during that conversation?
Beyond discussions of race, one of the things I found most interesting was the vice president acknowledging that Barack Obama chose him because, quite frankly, he is a white male with working class sensibilities and therefore capable of drawing voters to that ticket that perhaps would have been less comfortable supporting Barack Obama in 2008 and 2020. But Joe Biden really believes that the president picked him, the former president picked him because of his foreign policy experience. And his experience being in the Senate and on committees dealing with global issues. And Biden said that if he is elected president, much of his time will be spent cleaning up what he considers the mess President Trump has made domestically, but he actually thinks much of his time will be focused internationally and globally fixing what he believes has become a disaster under the presidency of Donald Trump.
All right, Eugene Scott. Eugene, really interesting to hear the candid thoughts there from Joe Biden. Thank you so much for joining us, Eugene.
Thank you for your time.